Hello everybody, my name is Gary Davis and I am with Autodesk Media and Entertainment. I am a solutions engineer and that means basically I'm a product specialist for 3D animation and compositing, and that's my specialty. Specifically 3ds Max has been my bread and butter going back to version 1 back in the discrete days, Kinetics days in fact, of 3ds or 3D Studio Max as it was called back then. I've had the great fortune of being able to use Max in a lot of different projects over the years, and non-photorealistic techniques is one of the things that will be one of my passions and we'll be getting into today. One of the things about non-photorealistic rendering, well, before I get into it, let's just go over the outline here, what we're going to hit today. We're going to first talk about non-photorealistic rendering types, and there's a lot of different ways and looks that you can achieve with that. Next, we're going to go into setting up for doing lots of different test renderings, because these techniques might be new to some people out there, or you know, hopefully they are, or maybe you've been using them for some amount of time, but you want to do a lot of tests before you go into production, and that's going to be true of any type of look. Today I'm going to be using Mental Ray, and we're going to talk about some Mental Ray essentials and then also some more in-depth things about Mental Ray. But a lot of these features that I'm going to be showing and a lot of these techniques can be used regardless if you're using Brazil or V-Ray or Final Render or whatever kind of render, or even the scanline renderer for that matter. Some of the map names might be a little bit different, but the techniques that I'll be using and showing today, I wanted to show this using 3ds Max. In this case I'm using 3ds Max 2010. But I wanted to show you everything today without plugins. So everything that you do today is basically 3ds Max out of the box. There's a couple of scripts I'll show a little bit later on, but those are free and available on the internet. The next thing I'll be showing is the kind of the workhorse for non-photorealistic in Max. It's called the Ink and Paint shader. It's been there for a number of years, but hopefully I'll have a few tricks up my sleeve to give it new life. Throughout the presentation, I'll be talking about design visualization specifics, and that basically relates to people doing either product design or architectural rendering and that kind of thing, where you want to show a process or a model in depth. And also toward the end I'll be showing how to combine a lot of these different techniques and workflows so that you can take this little bit that you might like and that little bit and sort of use them together. So what is non-photorealistic rendering? Basically what I'm describing it as is a departure from realism. A lot of times customers may come to you and they'll say make it look real, and that's because potentially they don't know all the alternatives that are available. This is going to be something that, again, you can use this a little bit, or you could make your entire workflow be non-photorealistic. But one of the points that I'd like to make is that when you know something, when you see something and it's photorealistic, you know it. But when you see something that's non-photorealistic, there's a lot of different styles that come into play. And I'll just take a look at some of these slides right here. And these are some examples we put together to just show an idea, give you some food for thought about the range that's available, possible. So here's a default, not a default, but this is basically an ink and paint setup. And you can see it's basically a grayscale image with black and white. But we also are starting to introduce a little bit of shadow in here, and so you have some direction within our scene. I'll go through these very quickly. This one introduces a little bit of a wavy line concept using also just a very flat look for just black and white drawing. This one here is starting to introduce a little bit of shading and color. We're also mixing shaders in here, so I'm using a Mental Ray Arch and Design water and a gradient ramp as my environment. But again, it's a very clean look, and it's very obviously not realistic. Moving along, this is essentially the same thing with a little bit of variation in our line weight. And this one is introducing a very common technique called ambient occlusion. This currently is using the default values of ambient occlusion, and later in the session I'll be showing you how to manipulate ambient occlusion in different ways than you might be used to if you're used to using it either in a compositing program or within Max for doing realistic work. This one here is starting to combine ambient occlusion with our line weight drawings, so we'll see that a little bit later. And this one is without, actually this still has ambient occlusion but a little bit of a less distance. This one here is once again very clean, but we have a nice gradation of color within our image, and we can still see some directional light from the sun, not from the sun, but our main light in our scene. This one here is actually interesting. This one's actually starting to use the photometric workflow of the Mental Ray Sun and Sky system. So this one was actually done using Final Gather for indirect illumination. And we can see that once again we're using the Arch and Design shader for our realistic water, but obviously the rest of everything else has a very clean non-photorealistic look with those technical illustration lines. So again, just food for thought that there's a lot of different options. This one here is starting to introduce color, and another subtle little thing that you might see in here is that we're starting to introduce ray trace reflections. So this is going to be, again, something to think about in combining all these techniques and finding what might be most advantageous for the type of production that you're doing. and this one here is starting to approach realism. Once again, it's still using technical lines, but we're starting to introduce texture maps like concrete and very specific types of grass and once again, sun and sky. So lots of different looks, as you can see. Some of these examples came off the internet, but these are just showing, you know, the same model can look and convey a very different message depending on what you're doing. And I'll just go through these ones very quick to once again give you an idea that you can get quite a different range of looks using different techniques in here. And so these actually start to get away from 3D look entirely and actually start to really look hand-drawn. So again, lots of different ways to manipulate your non-photorealistic. So why would you want to go non-photoreal? Some of the main reasons for me in my past experience is that it saves time, and time saves money. This minimal changes to modeling and animation. What I mean by that is that if you're coming from a background of modeling and animation, there's not going to be much change for this. However, materials, lighting, and rendering is where all of the time saving is going to happen, because these non-photorealistic techniques are very quick to put together, especially if you have a library already set up. Now, this is going to be useful if your animation that you're delivering to a client is detailing something about a model. In the case of architecture, for example, the model is basically everything. Or if you're going to do a process where, for example, you needed to show how a piece of a computer was put together and how little animated parts came in and something was assembled. That's going to be a great candidate for doing something like non-photorealism, because what's important is the process of how maybe water flows through a pipe and splits apart. It's not so much how the water looks, but you're indicating the flow of something or the process of putting something together. So that's what I say, that if your focus and attention to the customer is modeling and animation, non-photorealism will let you deliver that potentially a lot faster by using quick techniques for materials, lighting, and rendering. And that's going to be man hours saved to other tasks. What I mean there is, say you have 10 days to deliver a job, and in 10 days you were going to deliver it photoreal. Well, with non-photorealistic techniques, you might be able to cut that time down in half. As an alternative, you could still say, I need to use these 10 days, but I want to devote more time to modeling and animation, and I know at the very end I can slap together some quick non-photoreal materials and lighting and render it very quick. And again, here it'll say shorter render times. Typically, non-photorealistic techniques are going to render pretty quick. And one of the primary reasons for that is that a lot of them don't require final gather. So that's going to be something to definitely consider. Here, rendering NPR tests during a typical production cycle. What I mean by that is, even if you're delivering a realistic project, during the course of the project, you might do some techniques that are in here to actually just do an animation, maybe a turntable animation of a building or a model or something for client review. And you don't want to get them distracted with materials or anything like that. And this last thing where it says 3D rocks, what I mean by that is that 3D animation softwares obviously are very, very powerful, and they have a lot of different features in them. And one of the things that you could think about is doing things like physics tests. Now, this is an example that I got off the internet, and this is an old anime project that was done using 3ds Max. So here you can see Max. This is actually a rendered version of it, and obviously there's a lot going on in this scene, but it's a very stylized, non-photorealistic look. Now, what they did here was they took advantage of things like Max's reactor physics for doing breaking glass. This would be something that would be very difficult to do in a 2D hand-drawn manner, but doing 3D breaking glass is very easy. So using Max to get this kind of breaking glass look in a cartoon is a great way to take advantage of 3D, but have it look like it was a cartoon. Here's another example. You can see these cans are sort of flying, and once again we're using reactor physics to blow these cans up. A very simple scene in Max, but when it was rendered out, ultimately it would be composited into our scene, and you can see here there's hand-drawn characters sort of reacting to this, these tumbling soda cans or soup cans. But the soup cans have been composited in, and they're doing their thing. They're flying around, and they're not going to be very difficult to do because you don't have to do them by hand. You're letting reactor physics do the bulk of the work. And here's what it looks like in Max. And again, you can see a very simple scene put together, just set up for using reactor physics. Using this and kind of expanding on this idea of using things like physics, I put together some examples here. What you can see here is, we've got obviously our teapot scene, a big fan of the teapot, but it's useful for a lot of different things. And as I hit play on this, I'm going to just talk through some of these animations that we put together. Very clearly non-photorealistic techniques being used here, primarily ink and paint. I've got a couple of other tricks that I'll explain a little bit later. But one of the interesting things about this clip is that we're combining motion capture with reactor physics. So to do this animation by hand in a 2D environment would be a very cumbersome thing and very time consuming. But again, very clearly you can tell what's going on. If this were, I mean, and this is kind of a cute character doing his thing, but if you were going to try to explain something and you didn't want to go down the road of photorealism, this is a technique that you can use to show, again, like a process, or in this case we're taking advantage of a character using motion capture. This character was actually put together using the character animation toolkit that's been newly made available for Max customers. And the next clip is actually a little cartoon ambulance I put together. And what we're taking advantage of here is a 3D camera move, very clearly, a big camera move sweeping around this guy. We also have a pretty complex vehicle rig. You can see that the suspension of the tires is actually already automated. It's sticking to the ground. And some other interesting things about this clip is that we've got a particle stream coming out of the back of this ambulance. So we're taking advantage, in this case, of particle flow, moving 3D cameras, and also complex vehicle rigs. So a lot going on in this one, but once again, very clearly this is not a photorealistic view of something. We're taking advantage of all the things in a 3D animation software like Max, and in this case we're mixing photorealistic techniques of water, but with a very clearly, whoops, let me get back to that, a very non-photorealistic teapot and some cityscape back there, but once again I'm using reactor physics for doing things like a water effect. So here we're getting an automated water ripple that might otherwise be very difficult to do and very time consuming to do in 2D by hand, but we're taking advantage of 3ds Max's all the feature set and just basically lighting and rendering it out in a non-photorealistic way. So once again, you've got a lot of different ways to put together these techniques and a lot of different reasons why you might want to take advantage of non-photorealistic techniques. So again, just food for thought of putting some things together, or when and why you might put them together. Back to our friend, the PowerPoint here. So again, that kind of summarizes our 3D rocks aspect. Another aspect is for client review. When it says here, no distractions from shaders, what I mean by that is, and to use a case that actually happened to me, a very real world case, and I learned from this mistake I made. Many years ago, I was involved with a project, and a couple of us had promised a client that we were going to deliver a realistic, realistic deliverable, photorealistic. And we had a short time frame, we needed the money, and we put together this piece, and very sadly, we learned the hard way that if you get about 80% to photorealism, the client is going to potentially be disappointed. Now again, I learned from my mistakes, and hopefully you can learn from my mistake, but if you overpromise and underdeliver, that can be a pretty potentially bad thing. So what I mean by no distractions from shaders is if you have somebody that's just interested in the form of something, like a product design or an architectural building, for example, and you don't want to confuse them with, that's the wrong wood texture map, or this cloth doesn't look quite right, or the leather isn't as shiny as it would be in real life. Sometimes that can be a little bit of a distracting discussion from the point that you're trying to make of, what do you think of the shape of this chair? How does this model look? You're not trying to show them leather or tree bark or wood or anything like that. You're asking them about the model. So that's what I mean, no distractions from shaders. And if your final deliverable doesn't really have any relevance about materials and light, then you can go this route and show, again, like a process or an animation or still rendering or of a building and things like that. You can focus on the design and or process, not the look of something. And again, this thing doesn't allow the audience to be distracted with a critique of subpar realism at any time. That's exactly going back to that story I just said, the quick story, is that your audience might not be as sophisticated as you are understanding what computer graphics are all about. So like if they're looking at a wireframe, they're not going to quite get what that means. If they're looking at something that looks close to real but isn't photorealistic, a lot of times customers, depending on their sophistication of understanding of these techniques, a lot of times they're going to get distracted with something not looking real, and they're not going to be focused on the task at hand of describing a model or describing a location or describing a stage design or something like that. So again, this is just food for thought of other reasons to use these techniques besides making a cartoon. So what we're going to take a look at first is how to set up 3ds Max to do lots and lots of tests, because these shader types might be new to some people out there, and they're going to require a lot of different render tests. And this is going to be the case with a lot of different workflows in any 3D animation software. But the first thing I wanted to, and bear with me, this is kind of 3ds Max 101, but it's going to be a very critical thing. If I just made a box out here, and I made this box 2 feet by 2 feet by 6 feet tall, so that's roughly the size of a 6 foot tall man. what I'm establishing is a scale for my scene. And to establish the scale, you really want to make sure, if I come under Customize Unit Setup, you want to be really clear the difference between system units and display units. So if I bring this over here, my system units, currently I'm using the default of 1 unit equals 1 inch. That's how Max is thinking under the hood of how things like reactive physics, some things in particle flow, a lot of the values that we see later in this lesson will be relying on values from the real world, like feet and inches and things like that. So this is going to be one that's not just for non-photorealistic workflows, but this is going to be something that's very important to anybody working in Max. So again, I'm using 1 unit equals 1 inch. If you're going to model something like the solar system, you probably want to go up to something like kilometers. And if you're doing small objects like jewelry design or a very small miniature set, you might want to think in terms of, you know, millimeters or something like that. But regardless of what you put in here, let's say I switch this to metric and go to centimeters. This is how Max is working under the hood. If I say OK to this, even though Max is thinking in terms of metric right now, I'm looking at it because I'm an American. I was born in the States, so my brain thinks in feet and inches. So now, interestingly enough, if I said OK and looked at the modifier stack for this box, it's no longer 6 feet tall. This box internally is thinking of Max in this Max is thinking of this box in terms of centimeters now, not inches. And now it's only about 2.5 feet tall. So fundamentally, this has just changed dramatically the entire scope of my scene. And this is going to impact you if you're getting models from a lot of different sources. Say, for example, you go to TurboSquid and purchase a model and bring it into your scene. Well, that model might have been built somewhere else. It might be a great model, but you just need to take into consideration the scale of that model as it relates to the scope and size of the scene that you're putting together. So I'm just going to put this back to the default of 1 unit equals 1 inch. And again, I'll be thinking in terms of feet and fractional inches for this, and be back to working with our 6 foot tall box. So I just wanted to set that up so that you can make sure that you're setting up your files at the right scale. That's going to impact a lot of different things in Max. Another thing that I would encourage you guys to do is to check out or make a scene or a couple of scenes of just primitive shapes. So I'll take a look at this first one. You'll see this used throughout the lesson. But it's really just, there's nothing earth-shattering about this scene. Let's go ahead and look at it full frame. There's no lights in this scene at all right now. It's just a scene that I put together. Some interesting things that I'll point out about why I put it together like this. Let me just put on a wireframe overlay so you can see what's going on here. I've got a 6 foot tall biped from Character Studio in here, and that's going to establish what is the scale to a human. I have a very smooth teapot here with 9 segments, and I have another one with only 3 segments. And the reason for that is I want to see what these different shaders might look like on a smooth version of something, and I also want to see what they look like on more of a faceted, like low polygon version. Over here I've got an object, this torus knot, and this is an object that has self-intersections on itself. It also has holes that you can see right through it. These 4 cylinders right up front here are just tall, thin objects that I might want to make glass or something like that to see through, but they're also just thin objects. Over here I've got a thick object, and this box over here is also a very flat object. Right next to it I've got a sphere for a round object, and I might actually might want to have one of these off the ground so that it'll show what shadows are going to look like, you know, disjointed from the actual model when they're floating away, when a model is off the ground. This last object over here I've got is one that was created originally with Pro Booleans, and this is just to, again, test out to see how things maybe are looking like with a round hole or a square hole, and also if Boolean operations present any issues for the shaders that we're using. So I've put together a lot of these different scenes, and the point of these is that they render very quickly. But the key thing about these is that they're put together to the right scale. Now I've got a scene here that's about 20 feet by 20 feet, and it might be good for doing interior rooms and something like that. But if I was going to model a cityscape, for example, I'd want to establish the scale of my scene, and then I'd want to put together maybe a square mile with a lot of different buildings that are just cubes and cylinders and so on, but I want to establish that scale from being a lot farther out. Now that's not to say that you can't have a camera down in there and looking at something like a doorknob, but you just should be aware that as you're establishing these non-photorealistic looks, you're going to want to develop the shaders to be at the right scale and the scope of the size of your scene. Now jumping over here into our player, what you can see here is I put together, and these are just some renders that I put together. What's interesting about this one here is that it's got some glass cylinders, and I've kind of gotten tricky here with a little halftone in a fall-off map here to get this sort of halftone look. But here what I wanted to check was these cylinders are glass, and this is using an Arch and Design shader from Mental Ray. This is not using any final gather, and this is not using any sun and sky system or anything. It's just a sky gradient ramp for a sky. But what I'm checking here is how things are going to reflect and how they're going to refract. And in this case, it looks kind of cool. I could move on and say I know that this shader on this teapot is going to work. Some other examples here that you can see. This is a simple scene that I put together to just test fall-off maps. And again, I'm just kind of stepping through. Once again, you can see I've got our humanoid biped in here representing a 6-foot-tall person. A couple of other things that I was checking out in this particular file is to see what a shader would look like with reflections. And I have a gradient ramp so that over here there are no reflections. Here you can see I've got a little bit of ambient occlusion going on. I'm also checking in here what those soft shadows might look like. Moving on, just taking a look at a couple of other ones in here. Here you can see I've got a very simple scene put together with some wiggling cylinders, and I might just be checking to see what the shadows are going to look like, depending on what my lighting setup is. Another one, these are going to be testing area lights. This is an area light of 10 foot. This is an area light of 1 foot. And you can see that those shadows are very different. So once again, 10 feet, 1 feet. And I'm looking at these. These are actually the names of the frames that I've rendered out. Very clearly what I do is just make a simple scene, and I'll maybe put a non-photorealistic shader on something, and I'll maybe submit that to Backburner. It'll render very quick, but meanwhile I'll go back into Max, change one value, maybe the light changes from an intensity of 1 to 10, and then I'll render that in Backburner. And what I do is just queue up lots of these different jobs. So here you can see all different types of tests. This I'm testing, the line weight. Here's one with a little bit less thickness on it. It's the same exact scene. And another thing that I'm testing is maybe how long these take to render. So again, these are going to be things to check out, and I would encourage you to make a very simple scene that's going to reflect the type of workflow that you're going to do, and also to the right scale. This next section is a short one, and I just wanted to go over some real fundamental features about mental ray, and these are going to be important at any time you're using mental ray. However, some of the things that I wanted to talk about briefly impact NPR techniques a little bit differently than they do for photorealism. Before I move on, I'd like to give credit where credit is due. This model that I'm about to use was created by a guy named Marko Dubrovic, and it is available here. This is a public domain model that's used a lot in contests on the internet. You've probably maybe seen it. It's available for free, and I encourage you to go get it for a lot of these tests. Moving into our friend 3ds Max, you can see here this scene is a very basic block model. However, as we look down into it, you can see that this model has some archways. I've added some teapots to our tests, and this is what it looks like rendered right here. Now I went ahead and I applied a default ink and paint shader to our teapots. So what I'm looking at here is fundamentally a semi-realistic scene with textures and bitmaps and bump maps and things like that, but I'm also combining it with non-photorealistic techniques. Now the first thing I wanted to talk about mental ray fundamentals is anti-aliasing values. So if I bring up the render dialog in Max, what I'm going to be looking at here under the render panel, and again, once again, I am using mental ray. Under the render dialog, you have this minimum and maximum samples. Now, I don't mean to go over this at the fundamental 101 level, but what this means is that the minimum value is going to be the least amount of anti-aliasing on any pixel used, and the maximum will be the most. So you want to have the minimum be as little as you can get away with, and the maximum be as little as you can get away with for speed's sake. Now, where this differs with non-photorealistic techniques is that typically, if let's say I was going to do a video North American D1 720 by 486 animation, and again these aren't carved in stone, but I might try to shoot for like a minimum maximum of 1 and 4, or if I was really going to go to an extreme, I might go to like 4 and 16. That's getting pretty high. It's going to start to slow my renders down, but they're going to look better. But what I'm getting at in one aspect of this is that let's drop back to 1.4. You can see that 1 and 4 are actually one value apart. So typically if you're doing realistic work, there's going to be a lot of calculation in here where you want low and high values of contrast to be anti-aliased to a high degree to make it look good. Now for a number of releases in Max, you've got these performance tuning sliders over here under the rendered frame buffer, and obviously you can see that that's impacting what our anti-aliasing settings are. However, one of the things is that these are typically about 1 or 2 values apart. The point here that I'd like to make with non-photoreal is that you can generally push the minimum and maximum values apart more than you would with realistic techniques. And the reason for that is that if I look over here on this teapot, right along this edge where there's a black line is a very high area, is a high contrast area. So that this black line on this side of it is going to be looking at a realistic sort of stone shader, brick shader. And over on the left side is going to be this non-photorealistic, but right along that black line is a high area of contrast, so it's going to be using the maximum value. So I might want to say let's put that to 4. However, in here, all this dead space of blue, there's absolutely no contrast at all. There's literally no contrast at all. So a lot of these techniques using non-photorealism are going to have these big areas of flat color. And that's where you can get away with a minimum value, maybe down here at 1/16. So again, I'm pushing the minimum and maximum values apart. And if I just go ahead and do a region render on this for speed's sake, I can set that up and ultimately go ahead and hit render on this. And it's going to happen very quick. Whoops. Let's go. Oops. Let's do render region. And now what we're going to see is a very clear, nice rendering. We've got our values spread nice and wide apart. Minimum is pretty low and maximum is pretty high for high quality, but you're not going to see any difference. It will render quite a bit faster though. So again, pushing those values of minimum and maximum apart is going to be a really useful thing for any non-photorealistic techniques. Another feature within Mental Ray, I'll go back to rendering this full frame here, is a thing called material override. And this is going to be useful for a lot of different things, whether you're doing testing or production final renders. So if I were to take our teapots, I'll just delete our teapots out of the scene here for a second. Might have one left in there somewhere. Yep. What I can do is, if I looked at this render, it's going to use the brick and the bump map and so on. But if I was in the middle of a project, I could actually say, you know what, I want to maybe see a ink and paint version of this. So let's go make a new shader. And I'm going to make this be ink and paint. Oops. Let's go ink and paint. I'll just use all the default values. Why the default is blue, I don't really know, but maybe I'll just change it to sort of a light tan color. And I'll leave everything else default. And what I'm going to do is instance this shader into this slot right here for material override. And so you can see it's our ink and paint shader. Whoops, let's drop that in one more time. Had to turn it on first. Probably want to name it, but for time's sake I'll move on. And now when I go ahead and hit render on this, even though everything in my scene is using things like brick and water and sky and so on, the max file is going to actually render with one single shader over it. So this is going to be a way that if you're doing design visualization that's realistic, you don't have to change everything in your scene to get a non-photorealistic version of your rendering. So this would be a way, for example, that you could queue up scenes to Backburner and have non-photorealistic tests to show clients, what do you think of this model? Don't be concerned that the brick isn't right yet. So this material override is, again, just a fundamental Mental Ray feature that you can use in production. I will remind you, and hopefully you don't leave this on when you want to go and do your realistic rendering. Now this is going to be useful for a lot of different things, and ink and paint is just one technique of using this. Most of the techniques that we're going to be doing in here can optionally take advantage of this material override. So again, anti-aliasing is going to be a very big one, very important for doing a lot of different tests, and then material override is just going to be something that comes in handy when using Mental Ray for doing various techniques. In this section we're going to look at a few more things involving Mental Ray, but we're going to get into it a little bit more in depth. And the first thing we're going to take a look at inside of 3ds Max is a thing called ambient occlusion. Now once again, this is something that ambient occlusion is a technique that's used in a lot of computer graphics these days. But I wanted to show you some fundamental ways to use it in a non-photorealistic method. So this is the Sponza scene we saw earlier, and right now it has texture maps and bump maps, and it's set up in a fairly realistic manner. What I'm going to do is set up a Mental Ray shader here. So I'm creating a new shader that's just a blank Mental Ray shader. So this is at the top level just a blank material called Mental Ray. And in the surface slot, what I'm going to do is put the very first type of ambient reflective occlusion. So just by doing that, I'm going to actually go ahead and apply this to everything, select everything in my scene and apply it, because I just want to go kind of a non-photo real route. Now if I render this right now, what's going to happen is I'm using the default values of ambient occlusion, and once this kicks over and we've got it cached into our system, it's going to start rendering this out. Whoops, I still have the material override from the last example. Let me go ahead and backpedal on that. Worth leaving that mistake in my video, because you hopefully will once again learn from my mistakes. Let me make all the mistakes, let you learn from them. So I'm going to turn off my material override, and now I am in fact looking at the ambient occlusion. So I've applied a single default shader to everything in my scene. However, using the default values of ambient occlusion, I know that this render is going to happen and it's going to look pretty dark. In fact, it's almost pure black. I won't let this finish through, but you can see as the buckets are going through, my render, and I don't know if you can see it, but there's an archway right there. It's barely visible, but it's basically rendering almost pure black. Now the reason for that is that, and this is a common misconception, is that ambient occlusion, that people make the mistake of saying ambient occlusion doesn't work indoors. That's not exactly true. What's happening is that the default value of ambient occlusion is set to 0, which actually means infinity. That's a little bit of a misleading number there, but this is saying when I calculate my ambient occlusion, which if you're not familiar with ambient occlusion, it's basically a nook and cranny shader. It's not a shadow, and it's not a lighting effect of shadow and light, but it's a shading effect. So there's actually no lights in this scene, so this is not coming from any direction. It's coming kind of from all directions. But what's happening with ambient occlusion is it's looking in between for a corner, and the more that a corner is a sort of a nook and cranny, the more darkness it'll put in there. Light would get trapped and hence be occluded. So that's what ambient occlusion means. When ambient occlusion is set to the default value of 0, that means it's looking out to infinity. So everything, almost everything in the scene is considered a nook and cranny. So if I just change this value to say 5 feet and go ahead and hit render, what's happening now is on an object, say for example these walls, it's only going to look out 5 feet to occlude and find areas of darkness. Now this is the first case where you can see earlier in this lesson we talked about setting up scene scale. This scene is, I made sure that this scene was set up to the proper scale, and now you're seeing a very, default sort of foam core look to this scene, and I've got the anti-aliasing set pretty low for test renders. But you can see here that our nooks and crannies are very fine and very fine. So this is only looking out 5 feet to get this corner. If I were to drop this down to say 1 foot, our ambient occlusion is not going to be nearly as far out spreading. However, it's going to render a lot quicker. So there's going to be this trade-off of speed versus look. Not necessarily saying that less ambient occlusion or a smaller spread there, a smaller max distance is better. It's just an option. So this isn't starting to be, in fact, this one I'd say is a little bit too low because we're starting to lose the detail of what's going on in there. So again, lots of different tests that you might be doing, and I'd say let's, try something with 10 feet as just as a starting point. The other aspect of ambient occlusion that I want to hit is that's going to affect quality is the first value there of samples. And this is the case of lots of different things in mental ray where basically the higher samples you go, the better it's going to look, the longer it's going to take. And this is basically the little splotches that you can see in here. I could define this and say, you know what, I want to speed this up a tremendous amount, and I'm really only interested in the spread value. So I want to ride these two values and say, let's lower our samples so that I know it's going to render quicker, and you can see that it's looking really splotchy here, but I'm going to see, in fact, how far out that ambient occlusion is going a lot quicker. So you're going to ride these values and, in fact, use the sample values pretty low during your tests and then up that to maybe, well, it depends on the resolution that you're rendering. I don't want to give you specific numbers, but maybe something like 16, 24, 32, 64. Pushing it would be 128 samples, but again, I don't want to carve any rules in stone there for you and just let you kind of find out on your own. The next value I'll talk about is bright and dark. Now, if you're coming from a compositing background and you've used ambient occlusion, typically you're going to be compositing this in a multiply transfer mode over top of things. And when you want to multiply something with a transfer mode, you want it to be a black and white version or a grayscale image like this. So the bright value would be white in this case, or the default values, and dark would be pure black. However, that's, whoops, let me grab my pen again. That's not necessarily what you need it to be. So let's just have, I'll keep the low values there. I'm going to speed this up to go to 5 feet, so we'll have a little less ambient occlusion. But there's no rule saying that I have to use a certain color there. So if I said I've got green ambient occlusion, now everything in my scene is going to have a 5 foot spread of my ambient occlusion. However, the main bright color is going to be green, and the dark areas are going to be black. So this doesn't make much sense as far as just an entire green image. If that's what you were after, then it makes perfect sense. But what you're going to be able to do is set up lots of different colors in here. So I could say, for example, this one I want to have sort of like a tan concrete. And in fact, I'll show you a little trick. If I go back over to the main shader and look at the original brick here, let's get all the way down to our texture map of our brick. And this is just taking a second due to our capture software. If I look at this brick texture, here's our brick, and that's a photographic brick. We don't want to go photographic on this, but we kind of like that that color is there. I'll show you a nice little trick here. If you go to the old school architecture material, not the Arch and Design shader, but the architectural material, kind of the legacy one, there's a really neat feature in there, and that feature is this arrow button. What I can do is go take a bitmap, or any map for that matter. I'm going to copy this bitmap, come over into this material, and I'm really only using this slot for a quick utility. If I paste this in here and use this little arrow, what that arrow does is it samples the diffuse color, and it finds the average, and it makes an actual color swatch out of it. So now I can say right click, copy, and go over to our ambient occlusion value and paste it in there. So what we've got here is an ambient occlusion that is the average color of the original bitmap. So that's a nice little tip and trick for you. So what we've got basically is a default value for everything in our scene, and then I could maybe copy that shader down here and call this maybe a dark version of it. And I'll wait for that to catch up with me. So this could be called dark, and then I just go into our ambient occlusion, drop that value, you know, maybe let's split the difference, and we could apply this to maybe just the trim in our, let's just get all the trim and apply that. So again, I'm not going to do this whole scene, but you can see that we could set up a palette of values in here and different hues and whatnot, and we could also have varying degrees of ambient occlusion. On very small objects like doorknobs and things like that, you could have a very tight ambient occlusion, and on very big objects you might want to have a very wide ambient occlusion. A lot of times I'll do buildings with like 10 foot, and I'll have things that are about this big, only calculating ambient occlusion maybe 3 inches out. So you're going to be able to mix and match a lot of these different ranges of ambient occlusion, as opposed to in compositing when you typically only have one value. So this would be one way to set up palettes. Speaking of palettes, another way to do that, and a nice little trick, and this is going to be applicable for ambient occlusion or ink and paint shaders, or in fact anything that you do in Max. What I did was ahead of time I went into Combustion, and I looked at things like these paint swatches. So Combustion has a paint operator in there, and it has a really neat little feature that isn't specific to what I'm doing, but it's got these color swatches. And it also has things like the ability to load presets like metals and camouflage and so on. So what I did was, I'll go back into Max, what I did was ahead of time I copied that all out and made a single image that looks like this. So this is our color swatch. Now this isn't a texture map that we're going to use, but it's just a JPEG file that I have, and I'll include this with the files that come with the session. But what you can do, and this is a nice little feature in Max, anytime that I'm going to go to pick a color, let's say I wanted to copy this and make sort of a dark green. So I'll copy that shader. I'm going to say let's make this dark green. Let's call it dark green, and then go into our ambient occlusion. Instead of just randomly picking a color, what I could do is set up these sort of color swatches and say let's eyedropper. Whoops, I'm sorry, that's the wrong eyedropper. Let's go into our color swatch and eyedropper. When I click this eyedropper, what happens is that 3ds Max is now frozen, and I can pick anywhere on the screen, and I could say let's get that dark green value right there. Now what's great about this is that this image, I have nice color swatches set up, but this image could be anything. You could have an internet web browser open and kind of pull that over into Max and eyedropper from it. And this is going to benefit if you have multiple monitors big time. So that'll be a useful feature for you. So once again, I've got another shader in here, and I could start drag and dropping that on and building sort of templates of these different looks of ambient occlusion. Okay, so during the pause, what I went ahead and did was actually made a very primitive palette of colors, and as you can see, once again, we're using ambient occlusion. Excuse me, I have the same range of ambient occlusion across this whole image, but obviously I'm using things like green for where it might represent a grass in a courtyard or something. Now again, for architects and people doing product design, this is going to be nice because you can indicate form and function of something and also even animate it, but you're not doing any lighting. There's no lights in this scene whatsoever, and as you can see, there's no real directional lighting coming from anywhere. Ambient occlusion is being calculated sort of omnidirectional and coming from all directions as opposed to a directional light. So that's going to be one technique that's kind of interesting. Back to the point of doing lots and lots of tests. This was a bunch of renders that I did and I sent to Backburner, but here you can see I'm using once again that same scene with our 6-foot tall man, just our test scene. And this is with the default value of ambient occlusion. And you can see it's a little bit grainy, and in fact it's got a lot of that occlusion effect is spread out pretty far from the objects. Here's the default value, and this might be hard to see on the web recording, but here's the default value, and this is the default value with 64 samples. And again, this is the default value, and default value was 64. It's just a much smoother gradation in the ambient occlusion. Now it's going to take a little bit longer, but it's going to look a little bit better. Now this one is samples 32 with 1 foot, and again you can see this one would render very quickly, but it's a brighter image, and our ambient occlusion, the contact area of where two objects are coming together, is very, very small. In fact, it's it's set to 1 foot or 12 inches. This is the same one, samples 32, but the same number of samples are being spread out instead of 1 foot to 10 feet. So this is what it looks like. So again, samples 32 1 foot, samples 32 10 foot, and not that either one of these is right or wrong, but you can get the idea that the range of ambient occlusion is going to be very dependent on both the scale of your scene and also potentially the resolution that you render. The higher the resolution, the more samples you're going to need, because there's more divisions to spread that occlusion effect out over those frames. So excuse me, ambient occlusion is going to be a very useful thing for doing these techniques, potentially. It's just going to be yet another map type that you can get away with. Now moving on, another thing that I'd like to talk about in Mental Ray is a thing called contours. And this is where I'm going to actually combine these ambient occlusion techniques in this file. I'll bring that image up once again. So you can see that this is a nice, subtle, soft green and brown and grays and so on, but there's no outlines. So one method of getting an outline is using what's called a Mental Ray contour. Now to enable contours, you're going to have to do two things. One of them is to do it at the shader level, and that's going to be specific to, let me bring up the image one more time. That's going to be specific to, for example, I could say I want all these light tan columns to have an outline or a stroke, like a cartoon outline. Or I want maybe everything in my scene to have one. What's nice about the contours is it's a shader, so it's a map type. It's a selective effect. However, to enable contours in Mental Ray globally, you have to come into the render dialog and first enable them so that they'll even be calculated at all. So again, I'm going to come into the render dialog, come down here, and enable contours. Now optionally what you could do is drag and drop these map types into the material editor and instance them if you wanted to kind of take a look and see what these do. Typically you can leave these to the default values, but I'll just go ahead and show you that you can. I'll take all three of these and instance them into the material editor. And the last one. And what you can do is kind of take a look at these values, and on your own, I would obviously encourage you to play with these. So the first one has Z threshold, angle step threshold, and so on. And once again, you can see the importance of working in a real world scale, because this is showing in feet and inches and so on. I also have the ability here, fade contours and color contrast contours, material contours. This one here has no parameters, so I'll skip it. The next one here has glowing contours or compositing using max color. So three different ways, or three different global parameters that are going to be set up here. And again, just to reiterate, the big thing here is to go ahead and turn on contours. So that's going to mean that Mental Ray will in fact go ahead and calculate them. And now I can dismiss that dialog. So I've turned them on, and now what I would have to do is go put them on the shaders that I need them. So here you can see I've got my basic palette of those 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 shaders. And what I could do is optionally have different contour types for each one. I'll do these two tan ones, for example. I'll say now I'm back at the top level. Here's our occlusion map. But what I'll do is scroll down and see Advanced Shaders Contour. Now a couple of contour types. I'll just go with the simple one at first, just to keep it really simple. Pardon the pun. And you've got color and width. The color is going to obviously be the actual stroke color of the image. And what this width percentage means is that I'm currently rendering an image width that's actually 720 pixels wide. You can see right above my cursor there in the upper left, it says 720 width. Obviously also it's in the render dialog, but what it's going to do is this width percentage is a percentage of the width of the resolution that you're going to render. So the nice thing about that is if you're doing very low resolution test renders, it's going to be a certain width, and proportionately increase as your resolution does. So, and it's based on width. So if I render small test renders, theoretically this big, and then I proportionately res up for a high resolution final render, that that value doesn't have to change because it's a proportion or a percentage of the width of your resolution. So I'll go ahead and enable that. And now what I'll do is copy that, and so I'm going to go over to the other tan shader and paste instance that. So I'll just render that one out. Now what you're going to see is contours will be calculated. First it's going to do the original, the main rendering, and the way that contours are actually calculated is a post process. So it's going to be basically like a composite within 3ds Max, almost like a render effect if you're familiar with those. It's not a render effect, but it's similar in that it does the render, and then it's going to calculate the contours and composite them right on top of your image. So again, this will take a second. And once it's done, we're going to see that the tan objects in our scene will in fact have a little thin black stroke. Actually, it'll be, the default right now is probably a little bit thick. That 0.5% at this resolution might be a little bit thick. But you'll get the idea. Now it'll render the image, and then as you can see, it popped on a black line around only those certain shaders that have it. Excuse me. Now one thing to be also aware of is that these contour shaders down here, it isn't just for the mental ray shader type. So for example, I could have an Arch and Design shader and have it set up to be very photorealistic with water or glass or concrete or whatever you want, you know, just using mental ray's regular workflow. But if you're using mental ray, way down here, the very last rollout by default, it's the last rollout, is the mental ray connection. And if you open that up, you can see that among others, I have a contour there. So this is interesting for people doing product design or architectural design, or anybody for that matter, that you have the option to do a photorealistic type workflow and then optionally add stroke contours to one or more of the shaders in your scene. So that's going to be kind of a unique way of doing things. And it'll allow you to mix and match photorealistic with non-photorealistic. One thing I will mention about these contour shaders is that since they're a post-process that's composited on and calculated sort of after the fact of the primary render, is that they will not be visible to reflections or refractions. And in previous versions of Max, that was one way, and in current releases, it depends on which version I've found that you're in, but it's definitely something to, worth checking. So, you know, make a simple scene with teapots, make a couple of columns that are cylinders that are glass, and then try some test renders to see where your contours are going to be visible to reflections and refractions would be two things to test. Moving back real quick, I mentioned that this mental ray connection is available for Arch and Design. It's actually available for almost every shader type. So if I even go back to our friend, the standard shader, our old school, back from 3ds Max 1.0, we can see that a standard shader, if I'm set to mental ray, I can scroll all the way down, open up the mental ray connection, and enable contours as an option. So these contours are going to be not something specific to just you know, non-photorealistic things. However, it does add that technical line aspect to your drawing, and it may or may not be something that you're after as far as doing realistic stuff. Moving along, I'll actually add some contours to this. There's a lot of different types that you can see in here, and once again, for time's sake, I'm going to go from the most simple type, which is called simple, to one that's called combi. And combi, or combination, is actually sort of the best of all of those other types. And again, for time's sake, I'll just go through this very briefly, but here you can see I've got a near and far value, and that's based on real world units. And this is very much like a z-depth calculation for depth of field, where I can say the near z is a certain range from my camera. I usually put it at 0. And the far z is going to be a certain distance from the camera. And the farther you go away, the more it will become. The near color is near the camera, and the far color is far away. So I could do some extreme tests here and say, you know, a bright red near the camera and a bright green far away, and I would be able to identify where that range is, you know, using two very extreme colors. In this case, maybe I just want to have a slightly lighter gray as the distance fades away. Another thing that I could do here is pick which lights in my scene are going to actually calculate the width of the line. So once again, for time's sake, I'll let you play with these, but at the most simple level is this simple contour where you just give it a percentage, and I'm going to actually drop that down to 0.15. And then this one over here is the combi contour, and I'll go ahead and copy that. And for the rest of these shaders, I'm going to just paste instance that into our scene. Paste instance, and now I think we're all set. So now I'll let that render out, and you'll see our contours. So again, once again, it's going to do the calculation. This is where you might want to have, you know, only be rendering a region using this feature up here, the area to render. I will do this a full render so you can kind of get the effect of the whole scene. But again, something to point out here that's kind of interesting, we're not using any lights in our scene, and we only have 5 shaders within our scene, but we're getting a pretty good representation of what this space might look like. And also, as you can see here in a second, once the render gets calculated, we're then going to have more distinctive lines around the rest of our drawing. And this, in fact, will be over everything in our scene because they are using those 5 shaders. And globally, contours have been enabled. So it's doing the calculation, and there you go. So again, over the web, it might be hard to see this, but right in here, there's a little bit of hatching going on. That would be something to go back into the combi shader and sort of do some more tests in here with the width percentage and the distance from the camera. So that's mental ray contour shaders in addition to ambient occlusion shaders. So it's kind of a double, 2 different types of shaders working together, but ultimately you can decide which you do or do not want to use. Real quick, lastly, what I might do is if I wanted to just do some line art, and I've seen some architects do this that are actually going to do hand renderings, literally like marker drawings. What you could do is block out a sort of animatic with just primitive shapes and get a camera set up for your basic look as we've got here. And what I could do is make a old school standard shader. I'm going to make it pure white with 100% self-illumination, and then just come down here to our contour, and I'll just do a simple contour this time. And once again I'll make the lines a little bit thinner. I'm going to apply this to everything in our scene, or you could do this as a material override if you needed to. Select everything in our scene, apply it, and now we're going to get a very fast render because it's just a single white image, 100% self-illuminated, and now it'll draw the contour lines. Excuse me. So this resulting image would be nice to actually do. Well, you could animate it, and if this was all you're after, that'd be great. But an interesting use of this is that you could render a very high resolution version of this for printing it out, and then trace over it, or maybe marker in, or do some hand renderings with it. So this is a great way a different technique to do contour renderings. And one little side note is that if you look up in the help files, contours can actually be exported to the EPS file format. So this is a kind of an interesting hidden little gem in Max. It's a way to get vector output out of Max. So if you wanted a resolution independent EPS file, mental ray contours is one way to do that. This next feature is called the ink and paint material, and it's actually been in Max for many years. It's probably one of my favorite tools for using non-photorealistic techniques, and it actually is a ray traced effect. So while ink and paint can technically be used with the scanline renderer, or almost any renderer for that matter, ray tracers such as mental ray will actually render it a lot faster. And using mental ray will also give you the effect of combining this with ambient occlusion and so on, as we'll see in a second. But first I wanted to go over some of the basics of the ink and paint material. First I wanted to show you a scene. This is one of my favorite Max files. It's a old demo from when ink and paint first came out, and our friend Marcus Morgan made this, but this was actually put together primarily with ink and paint shaders, and this is probably the frame rate's going probably a little quick here, but you can see that we've got a kind of a Wile E. Coyote sort of effect going on. Some interesting other things in here. We've got some cartoon shaders, or ink and paint shaders on our particles. We also have some particle flow explosions going on, and we also have some reactor rocks going on. So as we saw earlier, this is a nice combination of using 3D for things like reactor physics, particle flow, and path following animation and so on. But the main look of this is very, very cartoon, and it has a sort of a nice quality of combining 2D and 3D. Another interesting thing that I'll show you back here on back up the animation a little bit is that ink and paint can be since it's a shader, it can be mixed with realistic shaders. So notice on the UFO is using a ray traced reflection, and the UFO itself is not using the ink and paint shader, but you can see ink and paint shaders very realistically reflected inside of that UFO. And since the ink and paint shader, the name ink and paint is the filled lines and the stroked lines, these are all calculated at render time, so this is going to be something that will be seen to reflections and refractions. So that's one of the reasons why I like it. Another reason is that it just has so many functional ways of being used. This is a scene that I put together that it's just kind of a forest plane, but it's a little more depth to the scene, and it also has a lot more going on, just in this sense of a lot more line weight and so on. But again, just some test files to actually see the the thickness, and in this case I've got sort of two-tone trees with black outlines and a very basic ground plane using a simple color. But these are going to be great for doing you know, lots of different types of cartoons and technical illustrations of all different kinds. So jumping into 3ds Max here, actually let me just flush the memory out of here so we've got some little overhead here. So jumping into Max, I've got one of our simple scenes set up because I'm going to be doing lots of little test renders. And this is the default shader, the default ink and paint shader. And if I go ahead and take a look at what that looks like, it's going to be pretty straightforward. Actually, let me re-render that for one specific reason. I did a little work behind the scenes there before I started this. So this is the default ink and paint shader, and what prompted me to re-render it is that in this particular rendering there's no lighting. So this is the default max lighting, and you can see that by using you know, very straightforward. Again, why this color is default to light blue I don't know, but it is, and I'll leave it there to just show you the default. But notice on this cube and on our biped character there's two hues or two values of the blue. Now how that's determined is the lighted. So you got this light color, and then paint levels is basically the number of steps it takes to get to this percentage right here. So the shaded value basically is a percentage of value or brightness to this. So let me show you what I mean. If I up that to say 3 or 4, if I look at the sample sphere here, you can see there's 1, 2, 3, 4 values of blue. And if I just go ahead and re-render this, now you're going to see on objects that are round, such as the teapots, they're going to have a little bit more gradation across there. So there's in fact 1, 2, 3, 4 values of blue from light to dark. And the darkest value of that blue is this percentage. What's nice about this is, let's say I drop this down to like 25%. Just by changing that without doing any lighting, there is no light in this scene, just default lighting. By changing that value to a lot less, like 25%, it's going to push the range of those paint levels farther apart. And it actually kind of introduces what I like to consider more of a high contrast image. And fundamentally speaking, as an artist, I think that looks a little bit more like a nighttime render. So this is kind of an interesting way that you can, by adjusting one value, you can make your scene look like just kind of switching it from day to night. Now this is going to be something that you may or may not want to change. I am going to go ahead and add a light in here to just kind of continue talking. In this case, I'm just going to use a standard Omni light, and I'm just going to drop it up and to the right of our scene so that we get some shadows in our scene. So I'll go ahead and turn on shadows. And in fact, in this case, I'm going to actually turn on our shadows using some of the newer features in Max. Let's go ahead and turn on soft shadows so I can see those in the viewport, so I can kind of really kind of place where our shadows are going. So that's going to be good. So what I've got now is an actual light in our scene. It is a shadow casting light, and this is going to be something again to play with on your test. So very clearly we're seeing these, you know, sharp shadows coming from a certain direction. Once again, we're seeing 1, 2, 3, 4 values of blue across there. The brightest value is the exact color here, and the darkest value is this percentage. So again, we're getting a nice high contrast. If I drop that all the way down to 0, the dark side of the objects are going to be pure black. So we'll have 4 values of blue, 3 will be visible, and the 4th will be pure black. So the light and shading will be you know, affected back and forth here. I'll put this just to 50. And one of the reasons I like using a higher value here is because when you use a higher value and the darkest dark side of something isn't pure black, that's almost like faking indirect lighting in a photorealistic workflow. And what I mean by that is that you don't need to have a lot of lights in your scene. And many times when I'm using ink and paint, I only have one light in my scene, and then I just rely on the fact that the darkest value will be at maybe 50, 60, 70% of something. So again, that's going to be something just to check out on your own, is that these paint levels are affected by the quantity of the percentage of the shaded value, if that made sense. So once again, just to kind of reiterate that, it's just a number of steps to get to this percentage. One thing about paint levels, cartoons, if you really observe on TV, typically they only have one value, or in some you know, more advanced cartoons, if you look at things like the Simpsons movie, not the cartoon, but the Simpsons movie, or the television show Futurama, those use a lot of subtle 3D animation effects using non-photorealistic techniques. But they typically stick to maybe 2 values where there's a light main color and a dark value. So again, this is going to be sort of an artistic call on your part. but I wanted to make that aware that you know, there are some sort of rules to cartoons if you want to really observe them in depth. One thing about these paint levels, this actually goes up to 255, and if I just drop this down to say 16, I wonder, there's a point where it actually starts to become what looks like to be a banding of color. And for me personally, I don't like to see this banding effect. Here you can see it right across this teapot, and it almost looks like I'm rendering an image that was from the 80s or late 80s, early 90s when the internet first came around, and you only had 256 total colors in like a GIF file, for example, the GIF file format. So here it almost starts to me look like color banding. However, what you could do, and again, this is just my personal opinion, I could up this to 255 and start to get an interesting effect where I am getting smooth gradation of color. I am using a full range of 8-bit, you know, 0 to 255, and there won't, you're probably a lot less prone to see color banding across there. So now we're getting a nice smooth version of ink and paint, but we're still getting that stroke outline. Whoops, excuse me. Sorry, I hope that didn't kill your ears. I'm going to drop this back down to, say, 2 before moving on. There's a couple more controls that are hidden inside of the ink and paint shader, and they're basically this first rollout that's closed up by default. If I open that up, you can see there's some basic options in here. These are nothing too you know, intimidating, but some interesting ones that you have are bump and displacement, and those are actually typically, you know, effects that you might think of to make something realistic. However, what I wanted to do was show you, actually, before I move on, I'll show you one more thing that I've wanted to highlight. No pun intended, actually, is the name called highlight. What this highlight does is actually puts a specular highlight on your material, and this is pretty straightforward. Again, you can see that there's, I've got, let's maybe bring this back up to 4 levels. So I've got some levels here, and then our highlight is going to be just that, a specular highlight. So if I took a look at that rendering, you can see that some of these objects just have a specular highlight. One of the things about specular highlights is that it kind of breaks the illusion of 2D. So if you're trying to fake two-dimensional cartoons, or maybe you're doing a hand drawing, say you're doing a kids show and the characters are hand drawn and composited in and the sets are 3D rendered, these specular highlights are going to kind of give away the illusion of 2D. And I'll show you that right here. This was actually rendered out ahead of time. And this file is actually, I wanted to show you a couple things, and I'll just step through this. On the teapot, actually on all the objects, there's a bump map, and it's just a procedural noise, but you can see that as this moves across, and I'll just kind of go back and forth here, as the light moves across, you can see obviously there's a specular highlight, and the reason it's not perfectly round is the bump map. So this is going to be a way to give the illusion of a deformed shape. Whether or not you want to go to full 3D displacement with mental ray is up to you, and again, that's just sort of a decision to be made as an artist. But again, look here, you can see all that banding of color, those 4 values across our blue box there. And if I just go ahead and hit play, again, I'll just kind of step through because I think the web speed of this playback is going to be a little bit harsh, but you get the idea of what a bump map would look like. This next animation is another one that we rendered out, and this is a simple robot. Here you can see 1, 2, 3, 4 levels of color, also on the green and the gray. So this is basically the ink and paint with 4 levels. But if I go ahead and hit play on this, what we've got is a single Omni light rotating around this robot. So nothing in this scene is moving except the Omni light. So as you can see, you know, right in through here, there's going to be a specular highlight coming across a lot of, or most of the parts, in fact, all of the parts of our robot here. And again, there's not anything right or wrong about this, but it is going to give you the illusion that this isn't, in fact, a truly 3-dimensional model. So that's just going to be something to consider whether or not you're going to use a specular highlight. I like to reserve those for only things that I might want to indicate that are metal or very, very shiny. Moving on to our ink controls, these are pretty straightforward, and this is basically the line weight. Again, I won't go through every single thing here, but I wanted to point out some things that I've found along the way from using this. Variable width is pretty straightforward. Here I can say I want a pixel value of 1, 2, I'll go to an extreme of say 10. But what's not very clear from the documentation is, and I'll just go ahead and render this. If I do ink values of minimum and maximum, it's basically based on the lighting. So on the thin, if a light is hitting an object, there'll be thin lines on the facing side, and on the back side it'll be using the thick lines, as you can see here. So again, our light is over here, so we have thin lines on the front side and thick lines on the back. However, this clamp value can be really important. And this particular rendering looks pretty good, but I can see a little bit of noise up in here. And sometimes without clamp on, you're just going to have a little bit more of a noise effect. And actually, sometimes that could be a good thing if you're going for like a sketchy look. It'd be something to play with. But what this clamp value does is it really forces it to say, really stay between these values of minimum and maximum. So that's what that variable width is going to do. Now, moving on to these outlines, right now you can see that I have blue paint with black ink. And there's all these little black color swatches in here. Well, these can actually all optionally be maps as well. But all of these are representing things like outline, overlap, underlap, which is actually turned off by default, smoothing groups, and material IDs. Well, quite often I get these confused in my head. So what I would do is be prone to say, let's make these really extreme examples just for testing purposes. So I could say, let's make our ink and paint be pure white. I won't use any highlights in this particular example, but I could make each of these be a very extreme color, like red, green, blue, and so on. And what that's going to look like, I already went ahead and rendered out a ink types here. And this again would be something that you could do potentially with like a material override. So you might be setting up your scene to look a certain way, but not be let me go back to Max for a second. You might not be too sure about which one of these ink types of outline or smoothing group. Outline is pretty straightforward. It's the silhouette of the object. But when you have things like teapot sections intersecting, or Boolean operations, or overlapping geometry, or multi-sub objects, sometimes these can be a little bit confusing to me. So what I'll do is set up a basic shader, potentially do it as a material override, and then I'll render out an animation. So here you can see that I've got the outlines are in red, smoothing groups are in yellow. I forget which is which, but I think you get the idea. Doing a lot of tests with these so that back in Max you'd have one shader type to really help define what these values are. And that's actually the big bulk of what I wanted to show about ink and paint. The lighting effects are really pretty straightforward. I usually get away with very minimal lighting in an ink and paint scene. What I'm going to move on to now is actually combining a lot of these techniques in some ways that I've found that are pretty interesting. Okay, so up until this point, what we've seen that are major things to really consider is ambient occlusion, contours, which are mental ray specific, and then we've seen the ink and paint shader. So what I'm going to show you now is some ways to combine these, and there's one more combination that will be coming up, but I wanted to kind of focus on ways to get the two of these main ambient occlusion and ink and paint brought together along with some other stuff. This is an example I showed earlier when I was discussing just the range of ambient occlusion, but if you take another look at this, you can actually see that we've got an ink and paint shader with our 1, 2, 3 levels across this, but you obviously see the ink and paint. And again, I'll just kind of show you different values of ambient occlusion. This one is 1 foot, but once again we see our bright areas from the ink and paint and the dark areas from the ink and paint. And we can really see where the lighting is in our scene. We do have shadows in some of these examples. This is actually, I'm sorry, this is default lighting, so these particular examples do not have shadows. So the way that we're going to do that is actually very simple. This is back to our Sponza scene that we've got, and I've basically just applied a white ink and paint to everything. It's got 4 levels, and we've clamped our ink width from 1 to 3. So what I could do is actually in the lighted value, this is going to be, remember, this is our main color. This is the paint if you want to think of it. What I could do is put a map in here. Now this is going to be open for a lot of exploration, but what I'll do at first is to just put an ambient occlusion in there. And that's the most simple way to combine these two effects. But now something to be clear about is that our color over here, our lighted color, is no longer driving the ambient occlusion. It's coincidentally the same right now because it's white, but if I were to say let's make this a bright red, in our scene you can see that in the viewport it's actually going to be bright red, but that's actually going to be overridden by the map of ambient occlusion being pure white. And remember, I want to set this to a value, say 5 feet, so that we're not calculating that ambient occlusion out to infinity. I'm also going to speed this up by dropping the samples down to 4. And now, again, I'm intentionally doing this on purpose to show you that we have a red object in our scene, or everything's red, but we're getting an ink and paint with white ambient occlusion in it. So if you think back to our examples we saw earlier when I used this same file, I was using ambient occlusion as the main look of everything, and then I was applying contours on top of it as a post-process. Well, this is going to be an alternative to that, and one advantage here is that we have all the ink and paint tools that you can see over here, things like ink, width. These are going to just be different values. Another thing that these have, I don't want to say they're better than contours, but they just have a little bit more options that you can put a lot of maps in here, and they can be procedural maps. They could be you could go get videotape of anything you wanted and put these in here. So these could be bitmaps or procedural noise or anything. But as you can see, we were getting that nice ink and paint in this case 4 paint levels, but we're also adding inside our ambient occlusion. And this is going to be one that you can, go nuts with. This is a really a look that I like using a lot. The next thing I'm going to do is actually combine this. While that's rendering out, I'll see how this behaves. This one is actually the same scene, but you can see that we've got ink and paint, ambient occlusion, and a texture map. So that's kind of an interesting look. And the way that the key to that technique is going to be what's called the composite map. Now the composite map has been in Max for a number of years, but in the previous release, I believe it was 2009, that got the newer composite map, and it's basically a godsend for putting the material together. So what I could do is say, let's go in and instead of using our ambient occlusion, again, just to be clear where we are, I'm back up at the top level. Instead of using go in and say, instead of ambient occlusion, I want to use a composite map, but I'm going to keep ambient occlusion in there as a submap. So we've got one layer in our composite, and I can very simply just say, let's add another layer. Let's reverse the order of these, because if you're familiar with ambient occlusion, it needs to be up on top of something else. And again, from compositing pipelines, you can think our ambient occlusion is here, and that's going to be composited with multiply. Whoops, where is it? Multiply as our transfer mode. And this is also a nice option that we can dial back the opacity. But what's great about this ambient occlusion in here is that it's at the shader level. So this doesn't require any compositing whatsoever, using a third party or another application to do compositing. This is all happening inside of Max. And another advantage here is that it's per shader. So this ambient occlusion I could set to be a very narrow value, like 2 feet on certain objects, and I could have other shaders that are set up with the same look throughout our scene, but they have a very wide ambient occlusion. Likewise, I could say, let's go ahead and put a bitmap in here. I'm going to go get the brick from our original, this guy right here. So this was one of the original bricks. So I'm going to just use that brick and say copy it. Let's go back to our shader that we're working on, and I'm just going to paste it right in there. And whether or not I instance it and how much it's tiled is kind of up to you. But again, what we're seeing here is an ink and paint value. Let me get back up to the top level here. All of our ink and paint values, and this is where I might want to put this color back to something that makes a little more sense to match our scene. Now again, this color is just for the viewport, but it's not going to render. So we've got 4 paint levels, a variable line width, which again, this could be per shader, so I could have really thin ink width on thin objects, and very big objects like buildings could have a nice big thick beefy line. So those are going to be things that you can change up. And now when I go ahead and render this out, we're getting that nice combination of ambient occlusion, a texture map that's actually starting to delve into photography or photographic workflows, but very clearly we're getting a non-photorealistic look, albeit this is a little bit different from a traditional cartoon look, because that ambient occlusion is going to really indicate where things are 3D. However, this might be good for things like design visualization, product design, or a very unique cartoon look to something. So again, I'll show you that while that's rendering out. I'll show you some different looks over in our composite. Here we can see that this was put together with ambient occlusion, of 10 feet. This is a value of 25 feet, so it's starting to get a little bit darker. And this is one with 50 feet. So it's the exact same, everything is the same, a composite map with ambient occlusion and a bitmap, but nothing is changing in here except the range of ambient occlusion, the calculation. So this is going to be a way that you can get very different looks just by changing a couple of different values back in our material editor of 3ds Max. In this next example, I'd like to discuss a little bit about architectural design and some considerations with lighting. Now, this is a rendering that without ink and paint or without any ambient occlusion or anything. This is using just a standard shader. But what we've set up here is the default mental ray sun and sky system. And as you know from using the sun and sky system, this requires a couple of other things that are automatically and typically turned on. One of those, whoops, let me bring up the environment dialog. One of those is that we're using a mental ray physical sky, and we're also using mental ray photographic exposure control. Now, one of the things that's going to be interesting about this that you're going to have to consider is that if I applied ink and paint to everything in this scene and I went ahead and hit render, so you can see that it's a pretty straightforward sun and sky render right now. And again, this is the first time in this entire lesson that we've used Final Gather, and I maybe should have mentioned that earlier, but everything we've done up until this point did not require indirect illumination. So this rendering that you're looking at right now is the first one that we're using Final Gather, and we're also using photographic exposure control. Again, this is more of like an architectural workflow for doing photometric lighting. But when I go ahead and render this out using an ink and paint shader, you're going to notice that it's rendering really, really black. And that's because the ink and paint shader doesn't really behave well with the photometric workflow. So there's a couple of different things that you could do here. One of them is a really neat little shader type that is kind of hidden away, and it's called a material to shader. So what I'm going to do is, instead of using our ink and paint over here, I'm going to say that I want to have everything in my scene use a default arch and design shader. And inside of our diffuse color, what I want to put there is an ink and paint, but you can see that it's not a choice. That's because ink and paint it itself is a shader. So this is a way, what I'm after is trying to put a shader in a shader. And that's not possible. Well, the way that you can do that is with this map type, and this is a mental ray map type called material to shader. And when I do that, all it gives me is a slot down here. Now, one little workaround that you're going to have to do here is if I put an ink and paint shader in here, you can see that it's there, and I in fact have an arch and design shader. You can see that nice specular highlight from our A&D shader. But down in the diffuse color, we have this ink and paint. However, it doesn't let you go down one more level and edit this. That's not that big a deal. All you have to do is instance the shader that you want into our material to shader. So now this is our ink and paint that we've set up ahead of time. But over here, we've got an arch and design. Let me get back up to the top level. And once again, here you can use, I'm not going to go into all the settings for arch and design, but this is where you have things like ray trace reflections, all kinds of good things for glossiness, the BRDF, which is great for doing fall off reflections and so on. But what we're getting is all the advantages of a photometric workflow, and inside our diffuse color is our ink and paint. So if I say, let's go ahead and apply this to everything in our scene, and now if I render this out, what we're getting is a final first it's going to calculate final gather, then it's going to do the rendering just like a standard workflow with photometric realistic materials. But what you're going to see here is that we're getting in fact our ink and paint outlines. So this is going to be a way to combine ink and paint, and this is actually happening inside of the render. Before, when we were doing mental ray contours, those were happening as a post-process. Well, these are going to be happening inside of the render, so they will be accurately reflected, they'll be accurately refracted, and so on. So again, if you're doing product design and architectural visualization and you do like that photometric workflow, this is going to be a way that you can sort of slide in an ink and paint shader inside of your arch and design shaders. And the key to that, and before I move on, I'd like to reiterate, the key to that, the way that you're combining shaders here is by using what's called a material to shader map. And like before when we just talked about the composite map, this material to shader map is going to be a great way to do a lot of different combinations of these things, because it sort of opens up the possibilities to say anywhere in any shader that I have a map slot, I can put another shader. So I really want you to play with this one. This is going to be a great one. So I could say I want an ambient occlusion inside of, or sorry, I want an ink and paint shader inside of an arch and design shader. Or you could reverse that and say, let's maybe make a new ink and paint shader. And again, at the top level, I could say maybe I want ink and paint, and instead of doing a composite map with ambient occlusion and other bitmaps, I could say I want an arch and design in here. So once again, I would say material to shader, drag and drop an arch and design, instance it, and now I've sort of got a pair where this material at the top level is a 4 value with maybe a variable line from 1 to 4, but inside is our inside of that is our arch and design. So if I bring this up, you can see I've got our banding effect from the 4 values of our ink and paint, but inside of there we have all the things going on over here like glossy reflections and so on. So if I went ahead and applied that, now the interesting thing about this is if ink and paint is the top value, you really don't want to go a photometric route. So if I said I want no exposure control, I want no photometric lights, let's get rid of our sun and sky system. So I'm kind of going back to just like default lighting. What I've been prone to do, and I've actually set this up ahead of time, you can use this, this will ship with the file, is in the environment dialog, instead of using all that crazy mental ray photometric lighting in the daylight system, what I'm prone to use is just a gradient ramp. So what I've done is in my material library that you'll get with this, I've set up, let me just look at the root value, and I'll look at all these maps. So these are just ones that I set up ahead of time for you to enjoy. And I've got some glass in here metals, and so on. But what I'm after right now is this sky that once again, I'll instance a map into the material editor, and then I'll drag and drop it into our environment slot. So now you can see I've got just a straight gradient ramp at minus 90 degrees, and it's set up to be a spherical environment. So that's going to be a nice spherical environment for our scene. But this won't require any, whoops, and I left one more thing on, and that's Final Gather. So if we're using Ink and Paint at the top level, we can drop our Final Gather off, and once again, this is going to speed up your renderings, and this is why I like Ink and Paint primarily for the tool here. So here's our straight render, no Final Gather, no indirect illumination of any type, and we've got Ink and Paint at the top level as our main look, but inside of that Ink and Paint shader, we're using an Arch and Design shader to get those glossy reflections and refractions. So again, this is going to be a great way, material to shader, to combine most any map types and shader types within the application. In this next example, I'd like to talk about managing all these materials once you get something set up. I'm going to give credit where credit is due. This is from our good friend Neil Blevins at neilblevins.com. And if you see this category called Soul Burn scripts, I'd encourage you to go check out Neil's website because he gives away lots and lots of scripts. But the one that I'm after here is called Parameter Manager, and it does just that. It lets you manage lots of different parameters that are common between lots of different things. And you'll see this is useful for a lot of things, but I use it a lot when I'm doing non-photorealistic stuff. What I've got right here is a basic scene set up, and you can see here a basic render of it. Oops, that's an incomplete render, but it's basically the same. These are all from the material library that I ship with the class, but it's basically the same kind of look across all these different Ink and Paint shaders. So they all have the same ambient occlusion setting inside of a composite map. They're all using similar line weights and so on, but they're different shaders. So what I might be after here is I want to do a lot of tests, as you might commonly do, but I want to say, you know, maybe I want all the ambient occlusion samples to be really low in this scene, or I want all the line weights to be 1.0, or I want all of the composite maps to be turned off, or something like that. So this is going to be where, if you have lots and lots of materials, sometimes you could use instancing for some of these things, but a lot of times you might not be able to. So this is going to be the case where I could take advantage of Neil's script. So what I'm using here is the Soulburn script lister, and I've just dropped it down. You can see I've got all of Neil's great scripts in here, but I'm going to go to Parameter Manager and hit Apply, and I have all these objects already selected in my scene. So it's going to take a second and kind of create an array of all these materials. And what this basically does, I'll let you play with this on your own, but what I'm after is, let's say for example I wanted to change all of these materials, and again I'll go to the top level to show you that these are in fact Ink and Paint. What I might be after is saying, let's go after, in here I want to go after, what parameter do I want? I want to do the materials on selected objects, and it's once again it's going to do a little bit of a calculation and kind of figure out what I have selected. Obviously the bigger your scene and the more you have selected, this could take a little while, but I guarantee you this will save you time in the long run. So I could say materials on selected objects. The value that I'm looking for is actually this paint level, so I can just say let's find materials on selected objects. There we go. And I'm looking for paint levels. Oops, I can't just need my glasses. Paint levels. Once again, it's doing a calculation. Every time you do a change, it's kind of like recirculating the value here. So here you can see 4. Now I'll draw your attention over here. You can see all of these materials, all these Ink and Paint shaders are using a value of 4. Well, if I drop this down to say 3, or let's make it obvious, say 2, and do Apply, what it's going to do is go through and do that change over all of those. Now what I could do is say maybe I want to change my ambient occlusion, so I'll say instead of materials I want to go to maps, because ambient occlusion is a map type. Once again it's going to calculate around, and then I'm going to say what value am I looking at? Well, let's go down into our ambient occlusion and take a look, and in this case what we're looking for is samples of 12. So I could say my value that I'm changing, and it's not the composite map, it's ambient occlusion. Once again it's going to do a quick calculation, and the parameter that I'm after is samples. So I could go to samples here, quick calculation, and I'll change my samples, and now I might be doing a production render, so I'll up that to 32 and hit Apply. So you can see it changed it right here on the purple one that I'm on, but let's hop over to this green material here and just double check that I go down into composite, go into the ambient occlusion, and indeed our samples have been set to 32. So we did this globally across all of it. Now the last one, just to point out here, remember when I showed you back earlier when the system units were working in inches, but the display is in feet. If I wanted to go and change this maximum distance, I'm still changing ambient occlusion. The parameter that I want to change is max distance. But here you can see it's set up for 10 feet. Well, the value is going to be a float value of 120. This basically means 120 inches. So I would have to do some quick math there, and say if I said 60, it's going to be 5 feet. So once I do apply, you can see that that carried over, and now I've changed all of the materials in my scene to have only 2 values of ink and paint. I upped the samples of across the entire scene of my ambient occlusion, and I dropped the maximum distance to 5 feet across all of the materials. So again, we're getting the same non-photorealistic look on all these shaders, but I've globally changed what I want within the scene. And this is going to work on the selected objects. So I could go through and select all the small objects in my scene and give them a very small ambient occlusion, or I could go select all the big objects in my scene and give them thick line weights or more samples or farther spread or whatever you want. So the parameter manager is a good one, and I highly recommend checking out all of Neil's scripts. In this example, what I'd like to do is show you a way that you could have a realistic version of your scene and a non-photorealistic version of your scene within the same max file, so you wouldn't need to update if you changed animation or something and you wanted to offer your clients a realistic version and potentially render a non-photorealistic version. So the way that we're going to do that is a trick using what's called the shell material. And the shell material is actually used for render to texture, but it's basically just a switcher. So what I could do is take advantage of that. And what I've done here is I've eyedroppered the material out in our scene, and it's a multi-sub object. But let's just focus on one of these, and I think you'll get the idea. What I could do is go in here and take a look, and this is again our main brick pattern, our brick texture. We can once again take a look at that just to remind you what we're talking about here. So it's our main brick. I might want to use that brick in our non-photorealistic, non-NPR version. So I'm going to say copy that. And let's just go back up to that top level there. So actually I want to be one in from the top level. I'm looking at this first material, in this case a multi-sub object, but it doesn't have to be. So this is the material that we're after to make a cartoon version of it. So what I could do is say, instead of a standard material, I want to use what's called a shell material, and I want to keep the old one. So what's happening now is I have 2 materials. This is the standard shader, and what I could do is create an ink and paint shader here. Well, I've already got one set up, and I'm just going to drag and drop it down here, but in this case I'm not going to instance it. I want to just copy it. And the reason I do that is because I could use this one, and I've called it ink and paint template, and I set this all up so that I can work and just keep dragging and dropping this to reuse as a starting point template. So once again, I can go back to our other one, and here I can say, what do I want to see in the viewport? And that's, here or there, which is right or wrong, but I could say in the viewport I want to see that brick, but at render time I want to see this ink and paint. And now I'll go into the ink and paint, and the template's already been set up for me. It's got ambient occlusion already multiplied over, and I could just go ahead and paste, instance, or copy that brick texture map in here. So now I've got a version of my material, and if I come back here, let's look at the material map navigator here. You can see that we've got a version that is realistic, and we have a version that is non-photorealistic. So we've got a switcher here. And again, this is something that you could use Neil's script for to collect this, all of the materials in the scene and just switch that value. So this is going to be a way that you can have a realistic version and a non-photorealistic version of one or more things in your scene and be able to switch that on the fly. This next example is one that I just wanted to sneak in if I had time permitting, and this is actually the use of what's called a fall-off map. As you can see here, our character Olaf is an ink and paint shader, but there's not much distinction. Now this is a multi-sub map, but the primary look of his green skin is an ink and paint shader that we're using here. And we've got currently we've got a composite map that's turned off. So I actually just wanted to show you a problem with that. Now there's a lot of detail in where his breast is and around his stomach, and there's muscles on him, but the ink and paint isn't really doing a lot to show that detail. So what we could do is instead put together a version, and this is the same. If I go to the top level here, you'll see I just have another version of this. So here's another version of our skin, but what I did in this particular example was it's the exact same ink and paint setup, but we have a composite put together, and that composite is ambient occlusion, and that's just like before. We're using ambient occlusion. I set it down to only 2 inches, representing a small area, on a size of a person or something. I've got the samples up pretty high, and then what I've got here is a fall-off map. Now the fall-off is basically the light color and the dark color, and I changed this fall-off type to be perpendicular / parallel, and the fall-off direction to be the camera. So this is basically going to mean that he's going to be a dark green color, this front, and as the curvature of his body moves away from the perpendicular to the camera, it's going to go to this light value. So what you're going to see here is a much different, it's going to be a subtle change, but there's going to be a nice fall off around the curvature of his body. And now you can see it's still using a very clear, distinct ink and paint look, but you can see a lot more detail underneath, and that's due to both the fall off map and the ambient occlusion working in tandem within our ink and paint. So that's going to be a nice option for doing things like character's skin or something that's got a lot of subtle value that you want to really be able to see distinctly in a 3D manner, but once again using a non-photorealistic technique of ink and paint. Well, that's going to do it for me. Obviously, this is a topic that I enjoy, and I hope you enjoyed this session. A couple of different things I'd really like you to remember is that there can be a lot of different reasons to go the non-photorealistic route in production that are not just because it looks cool or because you like it. There can be very valid reasons, and one of them being saving time. Cartoon versus technical illustration, I just want to remind you that depending on who your customers are or who you're talking to, the names of these techniques could be very differently received. For example, using the word cartoon in a architectural meeting might end it pretty quick. So I just want you to be aware that when you're talking about these techniques to people, be aware of who you're talking to and what they might prefer hearing. Features to remember in 3ds Max, these are just a few of them that I touched upon today, but metal ray ambient occlusion and metal ray contours are going to be a way to get very distinct looks for non-photorealistic or non-photorealism. Ink and paint is going to be the powerhouse, one of my favorites of all time. The composite map and the material map the material to shader map, those are going to be ways to combine all these techniques. So those are the ones that really open up a lot of ways to do these combinations of looks.